England, 1860, Victorian era. The chandeliers of Lord Pemberton's ballroom cast a golden glow over the sea of silk gowns and tailored evening coats below. In a corner, partially concealed by a marble column, stood Miss Isadora Harrington, her 40 years weighing heavily upon her shoulders as she observed the whirling couples on the dance floor. "Have you noticed?" whispered Lady Caroline Whitmore behind her fan to her companion. "Miss Harrington has appeared at yet another season. One would think after 2 decades of failure, she might accept her fate with dignity." The words, though spoken in hushed tones, carried to Isadora's ears like arrows finding their mark. She straightened her spine, smoothed the dark blue silk of her gown, a shade deemed appropriate for a woman of her station and age, and pretended not to have heard. At 40, Isadora had long since become accustomed to such remarks. The spinster of the esteemed Harrington family, she had watched as her younger sisters married, as her peers found husbands and established households, as the society that had once welcomed her as a debutante now regarded her with a mixture of pity and subtle mockery. "Miss Harrington," came a voice at her elbow. It was her brother, Edward, Earl of Westbridge. "You look rather forlorn. Shall I fetch you some refreshment?" "Thank you, Edward, but I am quite well," she replied with a practiced smile. "I was merely observing the new debutantes. Lady Pemberton has outdone herself this season." Edward's expression softened with concern. "Isadora, you need not attend every social function. No one would think less of you if I were to retire from society altogether," she finished for him, a rare flash of defiance crossing her usually serene features, "and become the reclusive aunt, appearing only at family christenings and funerals. No, brother, I may not have secured a husband, but I refuse to vanish entirely." Before Edward could respond, a hush fell over the ballroom. Even the orchestra seemed to falter momentarily. "The Duke of Blackhurst," announced the butler at the grand entrance. Richard Vallemont, the 6th Duke of Blackhurst, stood framed in the doorway. Tall and imposing in his immaculate evening attire, his dark hair swept back from a face that poets had compared to classical marble. At 38, he remained the most eligible bachelor in England, his title ancient, his fortune vast, and his estates among the most prosperous in the realm. "He looks particularly unapproachable this evening," murmured Edward. "I wonder what poor debutante will be thrust in his path tonight." Isadora watched as the assembled company parted like the Red Sea before the Duke. Despite his legendary wealth and status, Richard Vallemont was known for his aloofness, his precise manners, and his apparent immunity to the charms of even the most beautiful young ladies of the ton. "He has refused 3 perfect matches this season alone," continued Edward. "Lady Pemberton must be beside herself. Her daughter is among this year's offerings." "Perhaps he finds the parade of innocence tiresome," Isadora replied, surprising herself with the frankness of her observation. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Speaking from experience, sister?" "Speaking as one who has observed 20 seasons from the sidelines," she corrected gently. "There is a certain predictability to it all." As the evening progressed, Isadora maintained her position of dignified observation. She exchanged pleasantries with acquaintances, danced a single quadrille with her brother-in-law, and otherwise remained unobtrusive, a skill she had perfected over the years. It was during the supper dance that fate intervened. Making her way to the refreshment room for a momentary respite from the crush, Isadora collided with a solid form rounding the same corner from the opposite direction. "My apologies," she began, flustered, then froze as she found herself looking directly into the piercing grey eyes of the Duke of Blackhurst. "The fault is entirely mine, madam," he replied, his voice deep and melodious. For a moment, brief but unmistakable, his gaze lingered on her face with an intensity that caused her heart to skip a beat. "Miss Harrington," she supplied, offering a curtsy appropriate to his rank. "Miss Harrington," he repeated, as though committing the name to memory. Then, with a formal bow, he continued on his way. It was a fleeting encounter, the sort that would normally be forgotten before the evening's end. Yet, as Isadora rejoined the gathering, she could not shake the peculiar sensation that the Duke's eyes followed her movements across the room. Later, as the orchestra struck up a waltz, Isadora prepared to retreat further into the shadows. It was then that a familiar deep voice spoke at her shoulder. "Miss Harrington, might I have the honor of this dance?" The ballroom seemed to still around them as the Duke of Blackhurst extended his hand, toward the most unexpected recipient imaginable. Isadora felt the weight of 100 stunned gazes upon her. "Your Grace," she began, her voice barely audible above the music, "I fear you have mistaken me for someone else." "I am not in the habit of making mistakes, Miss Harrington," he replied, the faintest suggestion of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The waltz awaits. Will you do me the honor?" 20 years of social conditioning urged her to decline, to spare them both the inevitable whispers. Yet something in his unwavering gaze compelled her to place her gloved hand in his. "The honor is mine, Your Grace." As he led her onto the floor, the whispers erupted like a swarm of agitated bees. The Duke of Blackhurst, who had declined to dance with the season's most celebrated beauties, was leading Miss Isadora Harrington, 40 and unmarried, into a waltz. "You realize, of course, that you have just scandalized the entire assembly," Isadora murmured as they took their positions. "Have I?" he replied, seeming genuinely unconcerned as his hand settled at her waist. "I was under the impression I was merely dancing with the most interesting woman in the room." The music began, and Isadora found herself swept into the dance with a grace she had not experienced in years. The Duke led with confident precision, his steps perfectly matched to hers, creating the illusion that they had danced together countless times before. "You dance beautifully, Miss Harrington," he observed. "Practice, Your Grace," she replied, "though I confess it has been some time since I was last invited to waltz." "Then the gentlemen of the Ton have demonstrated a remarkable lack of judgment." Isadora could not help but laugh, a soft, genuine sound that drew even more stares from those around them. "You are either exceedingly kind or deliberately provocative, Your Grace. I have yet to determine which." "Perhaps both," he conceded, guiding her through a turn with effortless skill. "Tell me, Miss Harrington, do you enjoy these affairs?" "They serve their purpose," she answered diplomatically. "That is not what I asked." The directness of his gaze unsettled her. It had been years since anyone had looked at her with such focused attention, as though her thoughts and feelings were worthy of genuine consideration. "No," she admitted finally. "I find them rather tedious, but one must maintain appearances." "Indeed," he murmured, and for a moment she glimpsed something in his expression, a fleeting shadow of understanding that suggested he too wore a mask for society's benefit. As the final notes of the waltz faded, the Duke escorted her back to the edge of the ballroom. Before taking his leave, he bent slightly to speak near her ear. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Harrington. It was, without question, the highlight of an otherwise unbearable evening." Then he was gone, moving through the crowd with that peculiar combination of authority and detachment that seemed uniquely his, leaving Isadora to face the approaching tide of curious acquaintances, all desperate to discover what the Duke of Blackhurst could possibly have said to the spinster of Harrington House. In the carriage returning home that night, Edward regarded his sister with poorly concealed curiosity. "Well," he prompted finally, "will you not tell me what transpired between you and Blackhurst?" Isadora gazed out at the lamplit streets of London passing by the window. "We danced, Edward. Nothing more. The most eligible man in England does not simply dance with anyone, Isadora, particularly not when he has refused the hand of every debutante this season." She turned to face her brother, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps he was merely being kind." Edward snorted. "Blackhurst is many things, wealthy, powerful, respected, but kind has never been among his known qualities. The man has a heart of stone, if the rumors are to be believed." Isadora returned her gaze to the window, her reflection ghost-like against the darkness beyond. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "the rumors are wrong." Back at Harrington House, as her lady's maid helped her prepare for bed, Isadora caught sight of herself in the mirror. The face that looked back at her was neither young nor beautiful by society's standards. The bloom of youth had faded, leaving behind a woman with fine lines at the corners of her eyes and a certain gravity to her countenance. Yet for the first time in years, she looked at her reflection and wondered if perhaps there was something still worthy of notice in the woman she had become. Something that had caught the eye of the most discerning man in England, if only for the span of a single waltz. Foolishness, she chided herself aloud, dismissing the thought. A man like the Duke of Blackhurst did not seriously consider women like Isadora Harrington. Whatever his reasons for singling her out tonight, it would surely prove to be nothing more than a momentary caprice, forgotten by morning. Little did she know that across London, in the opulent study of his townhouse, the Duke of Blackhurst sat with a glass of brandy, contemplating the unexpected discovery he had made at the Pemberton ball, a woman whose intelligent eyes and quiet dignity had, in the space of a single dance, intrigued him more than all the bright young things of the season combined. The morning following the Pemberton ball dawned grey and drizzly, a fitting backdrop to Isadora's reflections as she sat at her writing desk, composing a letter to her married sister in Hampshire. She had almost convinced herself that the previous night's encounter with the Duke had been nothing more than a curious aberration, until the butler appeared at her door. "A delivery for you, Miss Harrington," he announced, with the faintest hint of surprise in his normally impassive voice. The footman behind him carried a magnificent arrangement of deep crimson roses, so abundant that they nearly obscured his face. As he placed the crystal vase on a side table, Isadora stared in bewilderment. "There must be some mistake," she began. "No, miss," the butler replied, extending a small cream-colored card on a silver salver. The messenger was most specific. With fingers that trembled slightly, Isadora took the card. Upon it, in a bold masculine hand, was written, "To brighten a dreary London morning, Blackhurst." "Heavens above," she whispered, the card nearly slipping from her fingers. The butler cleared his throat discreetly. "Will there be a response, Miss Harrington?" "I know. That is, not at present," she managed, still staring at the roses as though they might vanish if she looked away. When the servants had withdrawn, Isadora approached the flowers, inhaling their rich fragrance. In all her 40 years, no gentleman had ever sent her flowers, not even during her debut season when she had been young and moderately pretty, if never a true beauty. "What game is he playing?" she murmured, gently touching one velvet petal. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of her sister-in-law Charlotte, Countess of Westbridge, who burst into the room in a flutter of morning silk. "Is it true?" Charlotte demanded without preamble. "Did the Duke of Blackhurst truly send you roses?" Isadora sighed. "News travels with remarkable speed in this household. The servants talk, especially when something so unprecedented occurs," Charlotte replied, circling the arrangement with wide eyes. "Isadora, these must have cost a small fortune at this time of year." "I'm sure it's merely a courtesy after our dance," Isadora said, attempting to sound dismissive. Charlotte gave her a shrewd look. "The Duke of Blackhurst does not dance with spinsters, nor does he send them roses as a courtesy. Something very strange is happening." Before Isadora could formulate a response, the butler appeared again. "Lord Westbridge requests Miss Harrington's presence in the study." Downstairs, Edward paced before the fireplace, his expression troubled. He stopped when Isadora entered. "I've just come from my club," he began without preamble. "The entire town is talking about nothing but you and Blackhurst." Isadora sank into a chair. "Surely there are more important matters worthy of discussion." "Not in London during the season," Edward replied grimly. "Particularly not when the most sought-after bachelor in England singled out a—" He stopped abruptly. "A spinster?" Isadora supplied, her voice calm despite the sting. "You need not mince words, Edward. I am well aware of my status." Her brother had the grace to look contrite. "Forgive me. I only meant that it is unusual and people are curious. Blackhurst has rejected countless eligible young ladies. Why should he suddenly show interest in someone so manifestly unsuitable?" Isadora finished for him. "I assure you, I have asked myself the same question." Edward crossed to kneel beside her chair, taking her hand. "Isadora, I worry for you. If Blackhurst is playing some sort of cruel game, then I shall be no worse off than I am now," she replied softly. Her brother studied her face. "You find him intriguing, don't you?" Isadora withdrew her hand. "I found our brief conversation refreshingly direct, nothing more, and now he has sent roses, which is certainly flattering, but hardly indicative of serious intent." "Be careful," Edward warned, rising. "Blackhurst may be the most eligible man in England, but he is not known for his warmth. Some say he ended his last engagement because Lady Eleanor Brinsley once laughed too loudly at dinner." Isadora raised an eyebrow. "Gossip, Edward. I thought better of you." "Not gossip, concern," he corrected. "You have built a life of dignity despite society's cruelties. I would not see you hurt by a man incapable of appreciating your worth." The conversation lingered in Isadora's mind as she prepared for the Harringtons' annual visit to the Royal Academy exhibition that afternoon. It was a family tradition, one of the few social occasions where her status as an unmarried woman attracted little notice, as art appreciation was considered an acceptable pursuit for ladies of all circumstances. She selected a walking dress of deep forest green, a color she favored for its subdued elegance. As her maid arranged her hair, Isadora found herself paying uncharacteristic attention to her appearance, pinching color into her cheeks and selecting her finest lace collar. "Foolishness," she murmured again, though with less conviction than before. At the Royal Academy, the Harrington party moved slowly through the crowded galleries, pausing to admire landscapes and portraits amid the press of fashionable society. Isadora had just separated from her family to examine a particularly fine seascape when a familiar voice spoke beside her. "Turner at his finest, would you not agree, Miss Harrington?" She turned to find the Duke of Blackhurst standing at her elbow, resplendent in a perfectly tailored morning coat that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding height. "Your Grace," she acknowledged with a small curtsy. "Yes, his understanding of light is unparalleled." "You have an appreciation for art?" he inquired, his grey eyes studying her with that same unsettling intensity she remembered from the ball. "I do," she replied simply, "though I claim no expertise, merely an enthusiast's pleasure." "That is refreshing," he said, offering his arm. "Shall we continue to the next gallery? I find most commentary on art to be tediously affected, but I suspect yours might prove an exception." Aware of the curious glances directed their way, Isadora hesitated before placing her gloved hand lightly on his arm. "You risk further scandal, Your Grace. 2 encounters in as many days will set tongues wagging even more vigorously." "Let them wag," he replied dismissively. "I have endured society's speculation for years. It holds no terror for me." As they moved through the exhibition, Isadora found herself relaxing into their conversation. The Duke, it seemed, possessed a genuine knowledge of art, formed through travel and study rather than mere fashion. More surprising still was his willingness to listen to her observations, responding with thoughtful comments that built upon her ideas rather than dismissing them. "You have traveled to Florence, then?" he asked as they paused before an Italian landscape. "No," she admitted. "My knowledge comes entirely from books and exhibitions. I have never left England." Something like surprise flickered across his features. "Never? With your evident appreciation for art and culture, I would have thought—" "My circumstances have not permitted extensive travel," she explained simply, without self-pity. The Duke's expression shifted subtly. "A grave oversight. The Uffizi Gallery alone would provide you with a lifetime of contemplation." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Pemberton and her daughter, the lovely but vapid Miss Pemberton, whose failed attempts to secure the Duke's attention at her own ball had been the subject of much whispered commentary. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton exclaimed, her surprise at finding him in Miss Harrington's company poorly concealed. "What an unexpected pleasure. Penelope and I were just admiring the Reynolds portrait." "Lady Pemberton," the Duke acknowledged with a correct but cool bow. "Miss Pemberton, I trust you are enjoying the exhibition?" "Oh, immensely," gushed Miss Pemberton, edging subtly closer to him while pretending Isadora did not exist. "Though I confess, these historical subjects can be so dreary. I much prefer more romantic themes." The Duke's expression remained impassive. "Indeed. Miss Harrington and I were just discussing Turner's revolutionary approach to light and atmosphere. She has made several observations that I found quite illuminating." All eyes turned to Isadora, who felt a flush rising to her cheeks at this unexpected praise. "How interesting," Lady Pemberton replied, her smile tightening. "I had no idea Miss Harrington harbored such academic interests." "Few people take the time to discover what lies beneath the surface," the Duke replied, his tone carrying a subtle edge that was not lost on either woman. An awkward silence followed, broken only when Edward appeared at Isadora's side, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Isadora, Mother is requesting your company," he said, nodding formally to the assembled group. "Your Grace, Ladies Pemberton." With a graceful curtsy to the Duke and a polite nod to the Pembertons, Isadora allowed herself to be led away. She could feel the weight of the Duke's gaze following her retreat. "That is twice in 2 days," Edward murmured under his breath. And now the roses. People are beginning to talk, Isadora. People always talk, Edward, she replied wearily. Not about you, he countered. Not like this. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of strained conversation and curious glances. By the time the Harrington party returned home, Isadora felt emotionally exhausted from the constant scrutiny. Retreating to her private sitting room, she found another delivery awaiting her. A beautifully bound volume of Turner's collected works, accompanied by a note in the Duke's now familiar handwriting. For a fellow admirer of genius, perhaps you might permit me to call tomorrow at 2, Blackhurst. Isadora sank into her chair, the book clutched to her chest, her mind a-whirl with confusion and a dangerous spark of hope that she had thought extinguished long ago. Across town, in the elegant confines of his study, Richard Vallemont, Duke of Blackhurst, sat opposite his oldest friend, Lord James Hartwell, who regarded him with frank astonishment. "You cannot be serious, Richard," Hartwell exclaimed. "Miss Harrington, the woman must be nearly 40. "She is precisely 40, the Duke corrected calmly, "and possessed of more intelligence and genuine grace than any debutante I have encountered in the past decade." Hartwell shook his head in disbelief. "The ton will think you've lost your mind. There are a dozen suitable young ladies from the finest families who would simper and agree with every word I uttered, regardless of whether they understood it," Richard interrupted. "Who would marry me for my title, my fortune, and the prestige of being a duchess without the slightest interest in who I am beneath those trappings?" "And Miss Harrington is different?" Hartwell challenged skeptically. The Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Entirely different. She speaks her mind, she observes the world with clear eyes, and she expects nothing from me, which, I find, makes me want to offer her everything." Hartwell studied his friend with growing concern. "Richard, if this is some rebellion against society's expectations—" "It is not," the Duke replied firmly. "For the first time in my life, James, I have met a woman whose company I genuinely enjoy, who challenges my thoughts rather than merely reflecting them back to me. Is that so difficult to comprehend? For the Richard Vallemont I have known since Cambridge?" "Yes, frankly it is," Hartwell replied. "You've always been so controlled, so certain of your path." Richard gazed into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps it is time for a different path." "You realize what you're contemplating?" Hartwell pressed. "The scandal would be unprecedented. A duke, particularly one of your standing, does not marry a spinster with no fortune and no connections beyond a minor earldom." "I said nothing of marriage," Richard replied, though the slight tension in his jaw belied his casual tone. Hartwell laughed without humor. "My friend, you have publicly singled out a respectable unmarried woman of good family. You've sent her flowers and books. You've requested permission to call. Either you are contemplating marriage, or you are behaving in a manner most would consider dishonorable." The Duke's expression hardened. "You know me better than that." "I do," Hartwell conceded, "which is why your sudden interest in Miss Harrington is so baffling. You have refused the hand of every suitable young lady presented to you for years, citing various trivial flaws. Now you appear captivated by a woman who, by society's reckoning, is thoroughly on the shelf." "Society," Richard said coldly, "can go hang." Hartwell sighed, recognizing the implacable resolve that had made his friend one of the most formidable men in England. "Very well. But tread carefully, Richard. Miss Harrington has undoubtedly endured years of subtle cruelty from the ton. If you pursue her only to withdraw, the consequences for her would be devastating." For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered in the Duke's grey eyes, an expression so rare that Hartwell nearly missed it. Then it was gone, replaced by the cool determination that was the Duke's hallmark. "I have no intention of withdrawing," Richard stated with quiet finality. "Miss Harrington has waited 40 years to be properly seen. I intend to ensure she never feels invisible again." The following afternoon found Isadora seated in the Harrington house drawing-room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to disguise their trembling. The mantel clock ticked relentlessly toward 2 o'clock, each second bringing her closer to the Duke's promised call. She had spent the morning in a state of uncharacteristic indecision, changing her gown 3 times before settling on a deep burgundy day dress that complemented her auburn hair, now showing threads of silver at the temples, and brought a touch of colour to her pale complexion. "This is madness," she whispered to herself as the clock chimed the hour. "A man like the Duke of Blackhurst does not seriously court a woman like me." Yet even as the words left her lips, the butler appeared at the drawing-room door. "His Grace the Duke of Blackhurst," he announced, his tone suggesting that he too found the situation extraordinary. Richard Vallemont entered the room with the quiet assurance of a man accustomed to commanding attention wherever he went. Dressed impeccably in a charcoal frock coat and dove-grey waistcoat, he seemed to bring a different atmosphere with him, something electric and vital that made the familiar drawing-room suddenly seem more vibrant. "Miss Harrington," he greeted her, bowing over her hand with perfect courtesy. "You are most kind to receive me." "Your Grace," she replied, gesturing to a chair opposite her own. "I confess, your request took me by surprise." "A pleasant one, I hope?" he inquired, taking the offered seat. Isadora hesitated. "A puzzling one," she admitted finally. "You must be aware that your attention has caused quite a stir." A smile, brief but genuine, transformed his austere features. "Good. The ton has grown far too comfortable in its rigid expectations. A little disruption is long overdue." "Is that what I am?" she asked quietly. "A disruption to the established order." The Duke studied her face with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beneath surfaces. "You are many things, Miss Harrington, but a mere instrument of social rebellion is not one of them." The butler returned with tea, providing Isadora with a momentary reprieve from the intensity of the Duke's attention. As she poured for them both, she was acutely aware of the domestic intimacy of the scene, something she had observed countless times between her married sisters and their husbands, but had never experienced herself. "You enjoyed the book?" the Duke inquired, accepting his cup with a nod of thanks. "Very much," she replied, relaxing slightly at the shift to safer conversational ground. "The color plates are magnificent. Thank you for such a thoughtful gift." "It seemed fitting," he said. "Your observations yesterday revealed a genuine appreciation that deserves cultivation." Isadora sipped her tea, gathering courage for the question that had haunted her since the Pemberton ball. "Your Grace, forgive my directness, but I must ask, why have you singled me out for these attentions?" Richard set down his cup, his expression serious. "Because in a sea of artifice, you stand as a beacon of authenticity. Because when you speak, you say what you mean rather than what you believe I wish to hear. Because your eyes reflect a depth of thought and feeling that I find compelling." The simple honesty of his answer stole Isadora's breath. No man had ever spoken to her with such straightforward admiration, not even in her youth when she had still harbored hopes of marriage. "I am 40 years old, Your Grace," she reminded him, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions his words had stirred. "I have no fortune, no particular beauty, and no accomplishments beyond those expected of any gentlewoman. Surely there are dozens of young ladies more worthy of your interest." "Worthy," he repeated, an edge entering his voice. "A curious choice of words. Tell me, Miss Harrington, by what measure do you determine a person's worth? By youth, beauty, fortune? These seem remarkably shallow criteria for a woman of your intelligence." Isadora flushed. "You misunderstand me. I meant only that society—" "Society," he interrupted, "has consistently demonstrated a profound inability to recognize true value. I, however, am not so limited in my perceptions." A charged silence fell between them, broken only when the Duke rose and crossed to the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon light. "Perhaps I should speak plainly," he said, turning back to face her. "I have spent the past 15 years avoiding matrimony, Miss Harrington, because I have never encountered a woman whose company I could envision tolerating for a lifetime. Until now." Isadora stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Your Grace, if this is some kind of jest—" "I do not jest about matters of such importance," he replied, his expression grave. "I am well aware that my attention has placed you in an uncomfortable position. Society whispers. Your family worries, and you yourself must be uncertain of my intentions." He returned to his seat, leaning forward slightly. "Allow me to clarify them. I wish to court you, Miss Harrington, with the utmost propriety and respect. If, after a period of better acquaintance, you find my company as agreeable as I find yours, I hope you might consider a more permanent arrangement." Isadora felt as though the floor had fallen away beneath her feet. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "I have never been more serious about anything in my life," he replied simply. "But the scandal means nothing to me. The disparity in our situations is relevant only if we allow it to be. Your family's expectations are not my concern. I am the head of my house and answer to no one regarding my choice of bride." His calm dismantling of each objection left Isadora speechless. Finally, she managed to ask the question that lay at the heart of her disbelief. "Why me, Your Grace? After all these years of refusing every eligible match, why would you choose someone society considers thoroughly unmarriageable?" Richard's expression softened. "Because when we danced, Miss Harrington, I felt for the first time that I was in the presence of a woman who saw me, not the Duke, not the fortune, not the ancient title, but the man beneath all those trappings. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Before she could respond, the drawing-room door opened to admit Lady Harrington, Isadora's mother, whose surprise at finding the Duke of Blackhurst in her drawing-room was poorly concealed beneath a veneer of social grace. "Your Grace," she exclaimed, curtsying deeply. "What an unexpected honor! I do apologize for interrupting." "Not at all, Lady Harrington," Richard replied, rising to bow. "I was just discussing the Royal Academy exhibition with your daughter. Her insights are most illuminating." Lady Harrington's gaze darted between them, clearly struggling to make sense of the scene before her. "How delightful! Isadora has always been fond of art, though I fear her observations may lack the sophistication to truly interest someone of your background, Your Grace." Isadora felt a familiar pang at her mother's dismissive tone, a subtle diminishment she had endured for years as her marriage prospects faded. "On the contrary," the Duke replied, his voice cooling perceptibly. "Miss Harrington's understanding rivals that of many so-called experts of my acquaintance. You must be very proud of her accomplishments." Lady Harrington blinked, clearly unaccustomed to hearing her eldest daughter praised by anyone, let alone one of the most powerful men in England. "Yes, of course," she stammered. "Isadora has always been studious." The Duke turned back to Isadora, ignoring the obvious discomfort his presence had created. "Miss Harrington, might I prevail upon you to accompany me to the conservatory at Kew Gardens tomorrow? The tropical specimens are particularly fine this season." Aware of her mother's widening eyes, Isadora hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I should like that very much, Your Grace." "Excellent. Shall we say 11 o'clock? I will send my carriage." With that, he bowed to both ladies and took his leave, his departure leaving a vacuum of stunned silence in its wake. "Isadora," Lady Harrington breathed when the front door had closed behind him. "What in heaven's name is happening? First the roses, now a private call and an invitation to Kew. The Duke of Blackhurst is courting you." "It would appear so, Mother," Isadora replied, still trying to absorb the reality of the situation herself. Lady Harrington sank into a chair, fanning herself vigorously. But why, after all these years of being overlooked, to suddenly attract the attention of the most eligible bachelor in England? "It defies all understanding." Isadora winced at her mother's artless candor. "Thank you for that assessment, Mother." Lady Harrington had the grace to look abashed. "Forgive me, my dear. I did not mean... That is to say, you have always been accomplished and well-bred, of course, but at your age—" "Yes, Mother, I am quite aware of my age," Isadora interrupted with uncharacteristic sharpness, "as, I believe, is the Duke." "But what can he possibly want?" Lady Harrington persisted, bewilderment evident in every line of her face. Isadora rose, suddenly weary of the conversation. "Perhaps, Mother, he wants what any man seeks in a potential wife: companionship, understanding, and mutual respect." "At your age," Lady Harrington repeated, seemingly unable to move past this central fact. "It's unprecedented." "Many things about the Duke appear to be unprecedented," Isadora replied softly. "If you'll excuse me, I believe I shall rest before dinner. Tomorrow promises to be eventful." As she climbed the stairs to her bedchamber, Isadora's mind whirled with conflicting emotions, disbelief warring with a dangerous, fragile hope that she had thought long dead. Could the Duke truly be serious in his intentions? Or was this, as Edward feared, some incomprehensible game whose rules she did not understand? In the privacy of her room, Isadora sat at her dressing table, studying her reflection with new eyes. The face that looked back at her was handsome rather than beautiful, strong features softened by intelligent eyes and a generous mouth. Time had etched fine lines at the corners of those eyes and across her brow, but had also bestowed a certain dignity, a gravity that her younger self had lacked. Could he truly see something worthwhile in this face? She whispered to her reflection. Sleep proved elusive that night. Isadora lay awake, replaying the Duke's words in her mind, searching for hidden meanings or subtle mockery and finding none. His manner had been direct, his gaze sincere, his intentions stated with a clarity that left little room for misinterpretation. Yet still she doubted. 20 years of watching from the sidelines as other women were chosen, courted and wed, had left deep scars on her heart. The idea that she, overlooked unmarriageable Isadora Harrington, might have captured the attention of the most sought-after bachelor in England seemed more fantasy than reality. Morning brought no respite from her confusion. As her maid helped her dress for the promised excursion to Kew Gardens, selecting a walking gown of deep teal that complemented her colouring, Isadora found herself trembling with a combination of anticipation and dread. "You look lovely, miss," her maid assured her, arranging a modest hat atop Isadora's carefully styled hair. "Thank you, Bennet," Isadora replied, managing a small smile, "though I fear lovely may be an overstatement at my age." "Nonsense," the maid replied loyally. "There's more to beauty than youth, and if I may be so bold, miss, the Duke seems to have recognized that fact." Precisely at 11, the Blackhurst carriage arrived, a magnificent conveyance of gleaming black lacquer emblazoned with the ducal crest. The footman who handed Isadora into its luxurious interior treated her with the deference usually reserved for women of much higher rank, adding to the surreal quality of the morning. The Duke was waiting at the entrance to the gardens, his tall figure commanding attention despite the simplicity of his attire. As Isadora descended from the carriage, she observed a flicker of admiration in his eyes that sent an unfamiliar warmth coursing through her veins. "Miss Harrington," he greeted her, bowing over her hand. "You are punctual, another quality I find admirable." "Your Grace," she replied, dropping a curtsy. "Thank you for the invitation. It has been some years since I last visited Kew." "Then we shall remedy that oversight immediately," he declared, offering his arm. "The Palm House awaits, and I believe you will find the orchid collection particularly impressive." As they strolled through the magnificent glass structures housing exotic plants from across the empire, Isadora gradually felt her tension easing. The Duke proved a knowledgeable guide, sharing insights gained from his own travels and listening with genuine interest to her observations. They paused beneath the soaring glass dome of the Palm House, surrounded by towering tropical specimens that created the illusion of a far-distant land. "It's rather like stepping into another world," Isadora remarked, tilting her head back to admire the architectural marvel above them. "Indeed," the Duke agreed, though his gaze remained fixed on her upturned face rather than the surroundings. "Miss Harrington, may I speak frankly?" She lowered her gaze to meet his, her heart quickening at the intensity she found there. "Of course, Your Grace. I sense that you harbor doubts about my intentions," he said directly, "that perhaps you suspect some ulterior motive behind my interest in you." Isadora hesitated, torn between honesty and decorum. "You must admit, Your Grace, that your attention is unexpected. I would be naive not to question it." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Then allow me to address those doubts directly. I am 38 years old, Miss Harrington. I have spent the past 15 years fending off matchmaking mamas and their increasingly desperate attempts to secure my title for their daughters. I have been paraded before every eligible young lady from Land's End to John O'Groats, and I have found them universally tedious. Pretty faces concealing empty minds, or worse, calculating ambitions." He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "And then, at yet another interminable ball, I encountered a woman who stood apart from the usual preening and posturing. A woman who watched the proceedings with clear-eyed intelligence and a hint of well-earned cynicism. A woman whose conversation, when I finally engineered an opportunity to experience it, revealed depth and substance rather than the usual vapid pleasantries." Isadora felt her cheeks warming under his steady gaze. "You make me sound far more interesting than I am, Your Grace." "On the contrary," he replied, I suspect I have only begun to discover how interesting you truly are, Miss Harrington, and I find myself eager to continue that discovery, if you will permit it." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a group of fashionable ladies, whose exclamations of surprise at encountering the Duke of Blackhurst in such circumstances echoed through the humid air of the Palm House. "Your Grace," called Lady Winfield, a notorious gossip whose daughter had failed to secure the Duke's interest during the previous season. "What an unexpected pleasure to find you at Kew on this fine morning." Her gaze moved to Isadora, and a look of poorly concealed disdain crossed her features. "And Miss Harrington as well. How unusual." The Duke's expression cooled perceptibly. "Lady Winfield, ladies, Miss Harrington and I were just discussing the remarkable architectural achievements of Decimus Burton. You'll forgive us if we continue our tour." Without waiting for a response, he guided Isadora toward a less crowded section of the glasshouse, his hand warm and reassuring at the small of her back. "I apologize for the interruption," he murmured. "It seems we cannot escape society's eyes, even here." "It is to be expected," Isadora replied pragmatically. "Your movements are always of interest, and my presence at your side is noteworthy." "Because of your age?" he asked bluntly. Isadora blinked at his directness. "Yes," she admitted after a moment, "among other factors." "Such as?" "My lack of beauty, fortune, or particularly distinguished family connections," she replied honestly. "The fact that I have been considered firmly on the shelf for at least a decade." The Duke's expression hardened. "The Tun's assessment of worth is remarkably shallow. Beauty fades, fortunes rise and fall, and distinguished families often produce undistinguished progeny. As for being on the shelf," he made no attempt to hide his disdain for the phrase, "I find that particular social construct both arbitrary and idiotic." Despite herself, Isadora laughed, a genuine sound of surprise and delight that echoed pleasantly in the humid air. "Your Grace, I believe you may be the first person I've encountered who sees it that way." His expression softened at her laughter. "Then the rest of society is blind. Tell me, Miss Harrington, if you had not been constrained by convention, what would you have done with your life?" The question caught her off guard. I'm not sure I understand." "If marriage had not been the only acceptable path for a woman of your standing," he clarified, "what pursuits might have captured your interest?" Isadora considered the question thoughtfully as they continued their stroll among the exotic foliage. "I would have liked to travel," she said finally. "To see the art and architecture I've only read about, to experience different cultures and landscapes firsthand." "Where would you go first?" he prompted, genuinely interested. "Italy, I think," she replied, her eyes lighting with enthusiasm. "Florence, Rome, Venice, to see the works of the Renaissance masters in their original settings. And after Italy? Greece, perhaps, Egypt. The ancient civilizations have always fascinated me." She paused, looking somewhat embarrassed. "I sound rather like a schoolgirl with fanciful dreams." "Not at all," the Duke countered firmly. "You sound like someone with a mind eager for knowledge and experience, qualities I find infinitely more attractive than the vapid accomplishments society prizes in its young ladies." They had reached a secluded corner of the glasshouse, sheltered from curious eyes by a stand of bamboo. The Duke turned to face her, his expression serious. "Miss Harrington, Isadora, if I may, I wish to be entirely clear about my intentions. I am not playing a game. I am not seeking to cause a scandal. I am pursuing you because, in the brief time of our acquaintance, you have engaged my mind and intrigued my heart in ways no other woman has managed in 38 years of existence." He took her gloved hand in his. "I recognize that my attention places you in an uncomfortable position. Society will whisper, your family will worry, and you yourself may doubt the sincerity of my regard. But I ask only that you grant me the opportunity to demonstrate that regard through continued acquaintance." Isadora looked up into his face, the strong, aristocratic features that had launched 1,000 matrimonial campaigns, and saw nothing but earnest intent in his grey eyes. "Your Grace." "Richard," he corrected gently. "When we are not in formal company, I should like to hear my name on your lips." "Richard," she repeated, the intimate address sending a tremor through her voice. "I fear you may be courting disappointment. I am not young, not beautiful in the conventional sense." "You are beautiful to me," he interrupted, his thumb tracing a gentle pattern on the back of her hand. "Your intelligence shines in your eyes. Your dignity lends grace to every movement. Your smile, when you deign to bestow it, transforms your entire countenance." He stepped closer, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood that clung to his clothing. "I have watched countless debutantes parade their youth and superficial charms before me, Isadora. Not one of them has moved me as you did with a single dance, a single conversation." Isadora felt breathless, caught between decades of ingrained caution and the undeniable pull of the connection forming between them. "Society will be merciless," she warned softly. "Society has always been merciless," he countered. "To you for remaining unmarried, to me for refusing to choose a bride to their liking. Perhaps it is time we both stopped allowing its cruelty to dictate our happiness." The moment hung between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Then, with a gentle squeeze of her hand, Richard stepped back, restoring a proper distance between them. "I have overwhelmed you," he observed, reading her expression with uncanny accuracy. "Forgive me. I did not intend to press my case so forcefully on this occasion." "No," Isadora replied, finding her voice. "That is, I appreciate your candor. It is refreshing after so many years of polite fictions." He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his austere features and sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Then perhaps we might continue this conversation over luncheon. I have taken the liberty of arranging a private meal in the director's residence. He is an old friend and has kindly offered the use of his dining room." The remainder of their visit to Kew passed in a pleasant haze for Isadora. The private luncheon proved delightful, with conversation flowing easily between discussions of art, literature, and philosophy. The Duke, Richard, revealed himself to be widely read and thoughtful, with opinions that challenged rather than merely echoed the prevailing wisdom of their class. As he handed her back into his carriage for the return journey to Harrington House, he asked quietly, "Might I call on you again tomorrow?" "Yes," Isadora replied without hesitation, surprising herself with the readiness of her answer. "I should like that very much." His smile, warm and genuine, stayed with her long after she had returned home to face her family's curious questioning about the outing. That evening, Edward cornered her in the library, his expression troubled. "Isadora, what exactly is transpiring between you and Blackhurst? The entire town is talking." "I am not entirely certain myself," she admitted, selecting a volume from the shelf to avoid meeting her brother's concerned gaze. "He has expressed interest in a continued acquaintance." "Interest?" Edward repeated skeptically. "Isadora, the man is courting you, openly and without apology. It is unprecedented." She finally turned to face him. "Do you find it so impossible to believe that someone might genuinely desire my company, Edward?" Her brother had the grace to look abashed. "Of course not. You are intelligent, kind, and possessed of more substance than most women half your age. But Blackhurst, his reputation for fastidiousness, for impossible standards, the fact that he has rejected every suitable match for 15 years, only to suddenly show interest in—" He stopped abruptly. "In a spinster of 40, Isadora finished for him, her voice steady despite the sting. "Yes, it is unexpected. I have said as much to him directly." "And what was his response?" A small smile touched her lips as she recalled Richard's words in the Palm House. He said that society's assessment of worth is remarkably shallow, and that he finds the concept of being on the shelf both arbitrary and idiotic. Edward's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That does not sound like the Blackhurst I have heard described at my club." "Perhaps," Isadora suggested gently, "the Duke the Ton believes it knows is not the man himself, but rather the title they all covet." Her brother studied her face intently. "You like him," he observed, sounding faintly astonished. "I find his company stimulating," she acknowledged carefully. "His conversation is intelligent, his opinions thoughtful, and his manner refreshingly direct." Edward ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he had maintained since boyhood. "Isadora, I only wish to protect you from potential hurt. If Blackhurst is sincere, then I could not be more delighted for you. But if this is some passing fancy on his part, then I shall endure it, as I have endured everything else," she replied with quiet dignity. "But Edward, what if it is not? What if, after all these years, I have encountered someone who sees me, truly sees me, for who I am? Would you have me reject that possibility out of fear? Her brother's expression softened. No, he admitted finally. No, I would not. But promise me you will proceed with caution. Your heart has been preserved intact for 40 years. I would not see it broken now. I promise, she assured him, though in truth, she feared it might already be too late for caution. The seed of hope that Richard had planted in her heart was already taking root, growing stronger with each encounter, each conversation, each glimpse of the man beneath the ducal title. Over the following weeks, London society watched in fascinated disbelief as the Duke of Blackhurst's courtship of Miss Isadora Harrington continued with unwavering purpose. He called at Harrington House almost daily, sent flowers and books with thoughtful notes, and escorted her to exhibitions, concerts, and even the opera, appearing utterly indifferent to the whispers and stares their appearances together provoked. For Isadora, who had spent decades in the shadows of society, the sudden spotlight was both exhilarating and terrifying. She found herself scrutinized at every turn, her gowns, her hairstyle, her conversation all subject to unprecedented attention and often cruel commentary. I heard Lady Winfield say it must be some sort of wager, Charlotte confided, as she helped Isadora prepare for an evening at the theatre. That Hartwell must have challenged Blackhurst to court the most unlikely woman in London. Isadora's hands stilled in the act of fastening her earrings. And what did you say to that? I told her that if the Duke had made such a wager, he would have chosen someone truly objectionable, perhaps Lady Winfield herself, Charlotte replied with uncharacteristic sharpness. Honestly, Isadora, the jealousy is palpable. Half the mothers in London have spent years throwing their daughters at Blackhurst without success, and now he has chosen you. It's driving them to distraction. Chosen is perhaps too strong a word, Isadora cautioned, though her heart warmed at her sister-in-law's defense. He enjoys my company, that is all. Charlotte snorted delicately. A man like the Duke of Blackhurst does not escort a woman to the opera merely because he enjoys her company. He is courting you, Isadora. The only question is when he will make his intentions official. Isadora turned from the mirror, her expression troubled. Charlotte, do you not find it strange that after all these years of being virtually invisible to society, I should suddenly attract the attention of the most eligible man in England? Her sister-in-law studied her thoughtfully. What I find strange is that it took someone of Blackhurst's perception to recognize your worth when it has been evident to your family all along. The simple sincerity of the statement brought unexpected tears to Isadora's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. That evening at the Royal Theatre, seated in the Duke's private box, Isadora was acutely aware of the opera glasses directed their way from all quarters of the house. The production was Verdi's La Traviata, but she suspected that for most of the audience, the real drama was unfolding in their box, where the Duke of Blackhurst sat in close proximity to a woman 20 years past her debut. You seem distracted, Richard observed during the interval, his voice low enough that only she could hear. I am sorry, she apologized. It is difficult to focus when one is the subject of such avid observation. His gaze swept the theatre, taking note of the many faces turned in their direction. Would you prefer to leave, and give them even more to gossip about? She replied with a small smile. No, I shall endure. Richard's expression darkened. You should not have to endure an evening at the opera, Isadora, not because of society's petty malice. She placed a gloved hand briefly on his arm, a gesture of intimacy that would not have gone unnoticed by their observers. I am not as fragile as I appear, Richard. I have weathered the Tun's indifference for 20 years. I can certainly weather its attention now. His expression softened as he looked down at her hand on his arm. Your resilience is yet another quality I admire, he said quietly, though I find myself increasingly incensed by the slights you have endured all these years. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of visitors to their box. Lord and Lady Cavanaugh, whose daughter had been among the most recent debutantes to fail to secure the Duke's interest. Your Grace, Lord Cavanaugh greeted, bowing stiffly. Miss Harrington, what a surprise to see you at the opera. Is it, Lord Cavanaugh? Richard replied coolly. Miss Harrington is a great appreciator of music, unlike many who attend merely to be seen. The subtle rebuke was not lost on the Cavanaughs, whose attendance at cultural events was indeed more social than artistic in nature. Of course, Lady Kavanaugh murmured, her smile not reaching her eyes as she addressed Isadora. How commendable to maintain such interests at your age, Miss Harrington. Most ladies in your position would have retreated from society long ago. I have never seen the virtue in retreating, Lady Kavanaugh, Isadora replied evenly. Life has much to offer at every age, if one remains open to its possibilities. Richard's eyes warmed with approval at her response. Indeed, he agreed, placing his hand over hers where it still rested on his arm. A philosophy more should adopt, in my opinion. The gesture, intimate and possessive, caused Lady Kavanaugh's eyes to widen with shock. Lord Kavanaugh, sensing the increasing tension, made their excuses and ushered his wife from the box with barely concealed haste. As the second act began, Richard leaned close to whisper in Isadora's ear, "You handled that beautifully. Most would have withered under Lady Kavanaugh's barbs." "Years of practice," she replied softly, though in truth, the barbs had seemed far less painful with him beside her, his steady presence a shield against society's cruelty. Later that evening, as Richard escorted her to her door after the performance, he paused on the steps of Harrington House, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Isadora, I wonder if you might consider accompanying me to Blackhurst Manor this weekend," he said. "I host a small house party each spring for a select circle of friends and family. I should very much like you to attend." She stared at him in surprise. A private call was one thing, flowers and books mere tokens. Even public appearances at cultural events could be dismissed as the eccentricity of a duke known for his unconventional tastes. But an invitation to his ancestral home, to meet his family and closest friends, that was a declaration of serious intent that could not be misconstrued. "Richard, are you certain?" she asked, searching his face in the soft glow of the carriage lamps. "Such an invitation will be seen as—" "Precisely what it is," he interrupted gently. "A clear statement of my regard and intentions. I am weary of the speculation, Isadora. I wish to make my feelings plain, not only to you, but to all of society." Her heart thundered in her chest. "And what are those feelings?" In answer, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. "I believe you know," he said softly. "But if you require the words, I shall speak them here and now, regardless of who might witness." Isadora shook her head quickly, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. "No, not here, not like this." His expression gentled with understanding. "Then say you will come to Blackhurst. Allow me to introduce you to those dearest to me. Let me show you the place that has shaped me for better or worse." The invitation represented a threshold, Isadora knew, a point of no return. If she accepted, she would be publicly acknowledging the seriousness of their connection, inviting both increased scrutiny and inevitable disappointment if the relationship failed to culminate in marriage. Yet, looking into Richard's steady grey eyes, she found she could not refuse. Whatever happened, whatever pain might lie ahead, she would not deny herself this chance at a happiness she had long since ceased to believe possible. "Yes," she said finally, "I will come to Blackhurst." His smile, rare and transformative, illuminated his features. "You have made me very happy, Isadora," he said simply. Then, with a formal bow that belied the intimacy of the moment they had just shared, he bid her good night and returned to his waiting carriage. Inside Harrington House, Isadora found Edward waiting in the entrance hall, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Well?" he prompted, when she had handed her wrap to the waiting footman. "What did Blackhurst have to say for himself tonight?" "He has invited me to Blackhurst Manor for his spring house party," she replied, still somewhat dazed by the invitation and its implications. Edward's eyebrows shot up. "Good Lord, and you accepted?" "I did." Her brother studied her face intently. "Then it appears his intentions are serious indeed." "So it would seem," she agreed softly. Edward was silent for a long moment, then he stepped forward and took her hands in his. "Isadora, if this is what you want, if Blackhurst is what you want, then you have my full support. Whatever whispers or obstacles society may throw in your path, know that your family stands with you." Tears pricked at Isadora's eyes at this unexpected declaration. "Thank you, Edward," she whispered, squeezing his hands gratefully. Her brother cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. "Yes, well, it's about time someone recognized your worth." even if it had to be the most intimidating man in England. The weekend of the Blackhurst house party arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though spring itself had conspired to make the occasion perfect. Isadora travelled to Kent in Richard's personal carriage, accompanied by Charlotte as propriety demanded, though Edward would join them the following day. As the carriage crested a hill, Blackhurst Manor came into view, a magnificent Palladian mansion set amid rolling parkland, its limestone facade gleaming golden in the afternoon sun. "Heavens," Charlotte breathed, leaning forward for a better view. "It's even grander than they say." Isadora could only nod, momentarily overwhelmed by the reality of what she was doing, approaching the ancestral seat of one of England's oldest dukedoms as a potential duchess rather than a mere visitor. The very thought seemed absurd, yet here she was, responding to an invitation that could have only one meaning. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the imposing entrance, Richard himself emerged to greet them, descending the wide stone steps with an eager stride that belied his usual reserve. "Isadora," he said warmly, helping her from the carriage with gentle hands. "Welcome to Blackhurst." For a moment, they stood gazing at each other, oblivious to the servants arrayed on the steps or Charlotte being handed down behind them. Then, recollecting himself, Richard turned to greet Charlotte with correct, if cooler, courtesy before escorting them both into the entrance hall. The interior of Blackhurst Manor was every bit as impressive as its exterior, soaring ceilings, marble floors, and walls hung with ancestral portraits and priceless works of art. Yet despite its grandeur, there was a warmth to the house that Isadora had not expected, a sense that it was a home rather than merely a showpiece of aristocratic wealth. "I've had rooms prepared for you in the East Wing," Richard informed them, as footmen moved forward to collect their luggage. "The views of the rose garden are particularly fine at this time of year. I thought you might appreciate them, Isadora." The personal consideration touched her deeply. "Thank you, Richard." That was most thoughtful. His expression softened at her use of his given name, still a novelty that seemed to please him each time she employed it. "I shall leave you to rest and refresh yourselves before dinner. The other guests will be arriving throughout the afternoon." As a maid led them to their rooms, Charlotte leaned close to whisper, "Did you see how he looked at you, Isadora? If the man is not in love, I shall eat my best bonnet." Isadora shushed her, though her heart leapt at the observation. Could it be true? Could the Duke of Blackhurst, Richard, truly love her? The possibility seemed too extraordinary to credit, yet the evidence was increasingly difficult to dismiss. After resting briefly, Isadora began to prepare for dinner with Charlotte's help, selecting a gown of deep amethyst silk that highlighted her auburn hair and brought warmth to her complexion. "You look lovely," Charlotte declared as she fastened the last button. "Truly, Isadora, I have never seen you look better." Studying her reflection, Isadora had to admit there was a difference in her appearance, not in her features, which remained as they had been, but in her expression, her bearing. There was a light in her eyes that had been absent for years, a confidence in her posture that spoke of renewed hope. As they descended to the drawing-room where pre-dinner drinks were being served, Isadora was acutely conscious of the scrutiny she would face from Richard's inner circle. These were not the general society whose opinion she had learned to disregard, but people whose judgment mattered to the man who had, against all odds, come to matter deeply to her. Richard came forward immediately to greet them, looking resplendent in evening attire that emphasized his commanding height and athletic build. "Isadora, Charlotte," he said warmly, "allow me to introduce you to my guests." The group assembled in the drawing-room was smaller and less intimidating than Isadora had feared. Just 8 people, including Lord James Hartwell, whom she recognized as Richard's oldest friend from Cambridge days, Richard's younger sister, Lady Eleanor Vallemont, a striking woman in her early 30s, his cousin, Lord Henry Vallemont and his wife, and 2 other couples who appeared to be long-standing family friends. To Isadora's surprise and relief, the reception she received was uniformly cordial, with Richard's sister in particular going out of her way to make her feel welcome. "My brother has spoken of little else but you for weeks," Lady Eleanor confided as they took seats together before dinner. "I was beginning to think you must be some sort of paragon." Isadora laughed softly. "I assure you, I am nothing of the sort. Your brother's regard is flattering, but perhaps exaggerated." Lady Eleanor studied her with shrewd blue eyes. "The same shade as Richard's," Isadora noted. "I think not," she said finally. Richard does not exaggerate, nor does he act on impulse or emotion. If he has singled you out, Miss Harrington, it is because he sees qualities in you that are genuinely exceptional. Before Isadora could respond to this remarkable statement, dinner was announced, and Richard appeared at her elbow to escort her into the dining room. "My sister has not overwhelmed you, I hope," he murmured as they processed down the corridor. "Eleanor can be rather direct." "Not at all," Isadora assured him. "It's refreshing, actually. Directness seems to be a family trait." He smiled down at her, his eyes warm. "One you share, if I recall our early conversations correctly." The dinner that followed was unlike any social experience Isadora had ever known. Seated at Richard's right hand, the position of honor usually reserved for the highest-ranking lady present, she found herself at the center of genuine, interested conversation rather than polite dismissal. Richard's friends and family engaged her on topics ranging from literature to politics, listening to her opinions with actual attention rather than mere courtesy. Most surprising of all was the way Richard himself deferred to her views, drawing her into discussions and valuing her contributions in a way she had never experienced in society at large. "You see," he said softly during a moment when the others were engaged in their own conversations, "this is why I wished you to come to Blackhurst, so that you might see yourself as I see you, not as London society has labelled you, but as the remarkable woman you truly are." The simple sincerity of his words brought warmth to Isadora's cheeks. "You are very kind, Richard." "Not kind," he corrected gently, "observant, and increasingly certain that I have made the right choice." After dinner, the party retired to the music room, where Lady Eleanor was prevailed upon to play the pianoforte. As the evening progressed, Isadora found herself drawn into the warm circle of Richard's closest connections, accepted not as an oddity or an object of curiosity, but as someone of genuine interest and worth. It was a revelation, this glimpse of what life might be like, freed from the constraints and judgments that had defined her existence for so long. Here, in the intimate setting of Blackhurst Manor, she was not the spinster or poor Miss Harrington, but simply Isadora, valued for her thoughts, her conversation, herself. As the evening drew to a close, Richard escorted her to the foot of the grand staircase, lingering behind the others as they made their way to their respective rooms. "You seem to enjoy yourself," he observed, his voice low and intimate in the quiet of the great hall. "Very much," she admitted. "Your friends and family are most welcoming." "They see what I see," he replied simply. Then, glancing around to ensure they were momentarily unobserved, he reached for her hand, raising it not to his lips as propriety dictated, but pressing it gently against his heart. "Sleep well, Isadora. Tomorrow I should like to show you the grounds if the weather permits." The gesture, though subtle, carried a weight of tenderness that left her momentarily speechless. "I should like that," she managed finally, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. "Good night, Richard." As she ascended the staircase, she could feel his gaze following her, warm and steady as a physical touch. In her room, preparing for bed, she found herself humming softly, an unconscious expression of a happiness so unexpected, so complete, that it seemed almost too fragile to acknowledge directly. The following day dawned clear and mild, perfect for the promised tour of the estate. After breakfast, Richard appeared at Isadora's side, offering his arm. "Shall we explore?" he suggested, his eagerness barely concealed beneath his usual composure. They set out across the immaculate lawns, Richard pointing out features of the landscape with evident pride and knowledge. It soon became clear to Isadora that Blackhurst was not merely a symbol of his rank and wealth, but a living entity to which he was deeply connected. "My father saw the estate primarily as a source of revenue," he explained, as they paused at the edge of a small lake, watching swans glide across the still surface. "But for me, it has always been more than that. These lands, these people, they are a responsibility, yes, but also a privilege, to be part of something that stretches back centuries and will continue long after I am gone." "You speak of it with such passion," Isadora observed, watching his face as he gazed across his domain. "It's clear how much Blackhurst means to you." His expression softened as he turned to look at her. "It is my home, Isadora. The one place where I have always felt truly myself, unconstrained by the expectations and formalities of society." He paused, something vulnerable entering his gaze. "I wanted you to see it. to understand this part of me. The simple honesty of the statement touched her deeply. "Thank you for sharing it with me," she said softly. "It helps me see you more clearly. Not just the Duke that London knows, but the man behind the title. That," he replied, his voice low and fervent, "is precisely what I hoped for. So few people look beyond the dukedom to see the man. You have done so from the beginning, Isadora. It is one of the many reasons I find myself increasingly drawn to you." They continued their walk, crossing a stone bridge that arched elegantly over a narrow section of the lake. In the distance, Isadora could see figures moving about the grounds, other guests enjoying the fine spring weather. "Richard," she began carefully, "I must ask you something that has been troubling me." He glanced down at her, his expression open. "Anything. Are you certain about this?" She gestured vaguely between them. "Society has expectations for a man in your position. A duke typically marries a young woman of impeccable lineage, someone who can provide heirs and manage a great household. I am 40 years old, Richard. The likelihood of my bearing children is reduced, but not impossible." He completed for her, his tone matter of fact. "And while an heir is certainly desirable, it is not my primary consideration in choosing a wife." He led her to a stone bench positioned to overlook the lake and its surrounding gardens, taking her hands in his as they sat. "Isadora, I have spent 15 years watching young women of impeccable lineage parade before me, each more vacuous and calculating than the last. I have endured countless dinner conversations so tedious they made me question whether the continuation of my line was worth the lifetime of boredom it would entail." Despite the seriousness of the moment, Isadora found herself smiling at his blunt assessment. "Surely they could not all have been so dreadful." "Perhaps not," he conceded, "but none, not one, ever looked at me as you do, as though I am a person worthy of genuine interest, rather than merely a title to be acquired." His thumbs traced gentle patterns on the backs of her hands, sending shivers up her arms, despite the warmth of the day. "As for managing a great household, Blackhurst has run efficiently for centuries under the guidance of capable stewards. What I seek in a wife is not an administrator, but a companion, someone whose conversation I enjoy, whose opinions I respect, whose presence brings me peace rather than obligation." Isadora's heart quickened at the implication of his words, but still she hesitated. "Richard, you must know how people will talk. The tongue will be merciless." "Let them talk," he replied with quiet intensity. "I have never governed my life according to society's expectations, Isadora. I see no reason to begin now, particularly when doing so would deny me the chance at genuine happiness." He released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that caused her breath to catch in her throat. "I had planned to wait until this evening after the others had retired," he said, his voice betraying a rare nervousness. "But perhaps here, in this place that has witnessed the sweep of centuries, is more fitting." Opening the box, he revealed a magnificent emerald ring surrounded by diamonds, its antique setting speaking of history and permanence. "This belonged to my grandmother, the 5th Duchess," he explained, his eyes never leaving Isadora's face. "A woman of remarkable intelligence and character, who defied convention in her own time. I believe she would approve of my choice." With deliberate care, he slid from the bench to one knee before her, still holding her gaze. "Isadora Harrington, you have brought light into my life where before there was only duty. You have shown me that true connection is possible, even for someone as guarded as myself. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Isadora stared at him, scarcely able to believe the moment was real. Here was Richard Vallemont, Duke of Blackhurst, the most eligible bachelor in England, on his knee before her, offering not just his name and position, but his heart. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "are you absolutely certain? The world will not understand." "I am not asking the world to marry me," he replied simply. "I am asking you." In that moment, looking into his steady grey eyes, Isadora felt the last of her doubts dissolve. Whatever challenges might lie ahead, whatever whispers might follow them, the chance to share her life with this remarkable man was worth any price. "Yes," she said softly, then with growing certainty, "Yes, Richard, I will marry you." His expression transformed with a joy so naked, so unguarded, that it stole her breath. Rising, he took the ring from its velvet nest and slipped it onto her finger, a perfect fit as though it had been made for her hand. "My Duchess," he murmured, raising her fingers to his lips. Then, glancing around to ensure they were unobserved, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her lips. Their first, a seal on the promise they had just exchanged. When they finally parted, Isadora felt as though the world had shifted on its axis, that everything before this moment had been merely a prelude to the life now opening before her. At 40 years old, when society had long since consigned her to the margins, she had found love with a man who saw her true worth. "Shall we share our news with the others?" Richard asked, his eyes still bright with happiness. "Yes," she agreed, her heart full to overflowing, "though I imagine your sister, at least, may have anticipated this development." He laughed, a free, joyful sound she had rarely heard from him. "Eleanor has been hinting rather heavily that I should secure my happiness before you could change your mind about me." "Change my mind?" Isadora echoed incredulously, as if that were possible. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house where their news would be met first with delight from those closest to them, and later with shock and scandal by society at large. But in that moment, with Richard's strong fingers intertwined with hers and the emerald gleaming on her hand, Isadora found she cared not at all for what the world might think. She had spent 40 years living according to society's expectations and limitations. Now she would forge a new path, as the Duchess of Blackhurst, yes, but more importantly, as a woman who had found love when she least expected it, with a man who valued her for exactly who she was. The news of their engagement spread through London society like wildfire, igniting a conflagration of gossip, speculation, and thinly veiled disbelief. Drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs buzzed with discussion of the unprecedented match. The most eligible duke in England choosing as his bride a woman of 40, neither beautiful nor wealthy, who had long since been consigned to spinsterhood. "It must be some sort of bizarre infatuation," Lady Winfield declared to her circle of confidants over tea. "Men of a certain age sometimes develop these peculiar fixations. It will pass, of course, but unfortunately not before he has bound himself to her permanently." "Perhaps she has bewitched him somehow," suggested another matron, whose own daughter had failed to secure the Duke's interest during the previous season. "They say her mother's family had connections to those mystical Romany travelers." Such whispers reached Isadora's ears, of course. Servants talked, and Charlotte made it her business to report the most outrageous speculations with a mixture of indignation and dark humor. Yet to her own surprise, Isadora found the gossip affected her far less than it might have done before. "Let them talk," she said to Charlotte, unconsciously echoing Richard's words. "In time, they will find some new scandal to occupy them." The engagement was brief by society's standards. Just 6 weeks, during which Isadora found herself suddenly at the center of a whirlwind of activity. There were trousseau fittings, meetings with solicitors regarding settlements, consultations about the refurbishment of the Duchess's apartments at Blackhurst, and countless other details that demanded attention. Through it all, Richard remained a steady presence, attentive, supportive, and increasingly demonstrative of his affection, particularly when they managed to steal moments alone. Isadora discovered in herself a capacity for happiness she had thought long extinguished, a youthful joy that belied her 40 years. "You look younger every day," Edward remarked one evening, as they sat together in the library at Harrington House. "I would never have believed it possible, but impending marriage appears to agree with you, sister." Isadora smiled, touching the emerald ring that now adorned her finger. "Happiness agrees with me, Edward. Something I had nearly forgotten was possible." Her brother's expression softened. "You deserve it, Isadora. No one deserves it more." The wedding itself was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, a concession to Richard's position rather than Isadora's preference for a quieter ceremony. The church was filled to capacity, though Isadora knew many had come not to celebrate their union, but to witness what society considered a peculiar spectacle. Yet as she walked down the aisle on Edward's arm, her gaze fixed on Richard waiting at the altar, she found she cared not at all for the whispers that followed her progress. What mattered was the man before her, tall and commanding in his formal attire, his usually austere features transformed by an expression of such naked adoration that it caused murmurs to ripple through the congregation. Their vows were exchanged with clear, steady voices, a promise not just of fidelity and support, but of a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When Richard slipped the heavy gold band onto her finger to join the emerald engagement ring, his hands were gentle, his touch lingering longer than strictly necessary. "I now pronounce you man and wife," declared the bishop, and with those words, Isadora Harrington became Her Grace the Duchess of Blackhurst, a transformation so complete and yet so unexpected that she felt momentarily dizzy with the reality of it. The reception that followed at Blackhurst House, the Duke's London residence, was a study in contrasts. Genuine warmth from Richard's inner circle, mingling with barely concealed curiosity and skepticism from the broader society who had felt obligated to attend. Yet Isadora found herself floating through the afternoon with a serene confidence, Richard's steady presence at her side, a shield against any potential barbs. "How are you faring, Duchess?" he murmured during a brief moment alone, the new title sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. "Remarkably well," she replied honestly. "Though I suspect many of our guests are still waiting for you to reveal this has all been an elaborate jest." Richard's eyes darkened. "They will wait a very long time then," he said firmly, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "You are mine now, Isadora, as I am yours. The rest of the world can go hang." Later that evening, as their carriage carried them away from the reception toward the beginning of their wedding journey, a tour of Italy that Richard had insisted on arranging, knowing it had been Isadora's lifelong dream to see the art and architecture she had only read about, Isadora found herself overwhelmed by the day's events. "Are you well?" Richard asked, noting her silence as they left London behind. "More than well," she assured him, reaching for his hand in the darkness of the carriage. "I was just thinking how extraordinary life can be. 6 months ago, I had resigned myself to a future of quiet spinsterhood, watching from the sidelines as others lived their lives. And now, he prompted softly, now I find myself embarking on an entirely new chapter, with a man I have come to love more deeply than I ever thought possible." The admission, the first time she had spoken the word love aloud, came naturally without hesitation. Richard's breath caught audibly. Then, with a movement swift and decisive, he gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss far more passionate than the chaste one they had shared at the altar. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I have loved you, Isadora, since that first waltz," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "Though I scarcely recognized the feeling at the time, it has been so long since I allowed myself to want anything beyond duty and responsibility." Isadora raised a hand to cup his cheek, marveling at the freedom to touch him, to express the tenderness that had grown between them. "And now, he said, drawing her closer still, "I find myself wanting everything with you. A life, a family if fate permits it, a partnership in every sense of the word." "Even if society never quite accepts us?" she asked, giving voice to the one doubt that still lingered. Richard's laugh was low and unconcerned. "Society will adjust, as it always does. In time, our match will become merely another footnote in the annals of the Ton's history. But what we build together, Isadora, that will be our legacy, far more significant than any gossip or scandal." As the carriage rolled through the darkening countryside toward Dover, where a ship awaited to carry them to the continent, and the beginning of their shared adventures, Isadora rested her head against her husband's shoulder, marveling at the journey that had brought her here. At 40 years old, when the world had deemed her past all possibility of romance or new beginnings, she had found not just love, but a partner who valued her for exactly who she was, not despite her age and experience, but because of the wisdom and character they had helped shape. And Richard, who had spent years holding the world at arm's length, had found in her a companion whose presence enriched rather than diminished him, whose love had awakened parts of himself he had thought forever dormant. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, the potential skepticism of society, the practical considerations of their future, the adjustments of building a life together after years of independence. But they would face them as equals, bound not just by the legal ties of matrimony, but by a deep and genuine connection that had defied all expectations. "I love you, Richard," Isadora whispered into the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. His arm tightened around her shoulders, his lips brushing her temple in a gesture of tenderness that needed no words. Yet he offered them anyway, his deep voice soft in the intimate darkness of the carriage. "And I love you, my Duchess, more than I ever thought possible." The grand ballroom of Blackhurst Manor glittered with candlelight, the air fragrant with the scent of hothouse flowers, as the cream of society mingled and danced beneath the soaring ceilings. At the centre of it all stood the Duke and Duchess of Blackhurst, their expressions serene as they greeted their guests with gracious warmth. "They make a striking couple, do they not?" murmured Lady Eleanor to Edward, who had just claimed her hand for a dance. "One would hardly credit the scandal their match once caused." Edward smiled, watching his sister as she stood beside her husband, her auburn hair, now liberally streaked with silver, elegantly arranged and adorned with the Blackhurst emeralds. At 42, Isadora radiated a confidence and contentment that made her more beautiful than she had ever been in her youth. "Society has a short memory when confronted with success," he observed, leading Eleanor into the pattern of the dance. "And by any measure, their marriage has been a remarkable success." Indeed, the tongue that had once whispered so cruelly about the Duke's inexplicable choice had gradually fallen silent as the months passed, and Richard's devotion to his older bride showed no signs of waning. So if anything, his regard for Isadora had only deepened with time, evident in the way his eyes sought her across crowded rooms, in the attentiveness with which he listened when she spoke, in the private smiles they shared that hinted at a connection far deeper than mere social convenience. Across the ballroom, a young footman approached the Duchess, bending to whisper something in her ear. Isadora's face lit with joy, and she turned immediately to touch her husband's arm, conveying some news that caused his usually reserved expression to transform with delight. With brief apologies to their guests, the Duke and Duchess slipped from the ballroom, leaving their guests to speculate on their sudden departure. "The nursery, I imagine," Lady Eleanor explained to Edward as they completed their dance. "My nephew has a remarkable talent for timing his demands to coincide with social obligations." Edward chuckled, a trait he seems to have inherited from his father, if Richard's strategic exits from tedious parliamentary debates are any indication. The miracle of Isadora's pregnancy, coming just months after their wedding, had silenced the last of society's skeptics. The birth of James Edward Richard Vallemont, Marquess of Westmoreland and heir to the Dukedom of Blackhurst, 10 months after their marriage had transformed scandal into fairy tale in the eyes of the ton. Upstairs, in the spacious nursery suite overlooking the moonlit gardens, Isadora and Richard stood side by side at the cradle of their 8-month-old son, watching as the nurse settled him back to sleep after his evening feeding. "He has your eyes," Richard observed softly, his arm around his wife's waist. "And your stubbornness," Isadora replied with a gentle laugh, "demanding attention in the middle of our spring ball." Richard pressed a kiss to her temple, inhaling the familiar lavender scent of her hair. "I can hardly blame him. I, too, prefer your company to that of our entire guest list combined." The nurse curtsied and withdrew, leaving them alone with their sleeping son, the child that society had deemed impossible, yet who had arrived nonetheless, healthy and strong, and adored beyond measure by both his parents. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life," Isadora confessed, leaning into her husband's embrace. "That all of this, you, James Blackhurst, is real and not some dream from which I'll wake." "Very real," Richard assured her, turning her gently in his arms to face him. "Though I confess to similar moments of disbelief. How did I exist for 38 years without you, Isadora? It seems inconceivable now." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the beloved features that had become as familiar to her as her own. "We found each other when we were ready, I think, when we had both lived enough to recognize true value when we saw it." Richard smiled, the warm, genuine smile that he reserved exclusively for her and their son. "The most valuable discovery of my life," he agreed, bending to capture her lips in a tender kiss. Below, the music from the ballroom drifted up through the open windows, a reminder of the social obligations awaiting their return. Yet, for a moment longer, they lingered, wrapped in each other's arms beside their sleeping child, savoring the precious reality of the family they had created together. "We should return to our guests," Isadora murmured eventually, though she made no move to leave the circle of his arms. "In a moment," Richard replied, his eyes still drinking in the sight of her, his wife, his Duchess, the woman who had transformed his life with her intelligence, her dignity, and her boundless capacity for love. Let them wait just a little longer. And so they remained, the Duke and his unexpected Duchess, their extraordinary love story having silenced the whispers and defied the conventions of their world. Together, they had rewritten the rules of what was possible, proving that true connection could flourish at any age, that value lay not in youth or beauty, but in the depth and quality of one's character, and that love, when genuine, could overcome even the most entrenched societal expectations. In the cradle beside them, young James stirred briefly, his small hand reaching out in sleep. Isadora gently tucked the blanket around him, her heart so full of love for her family that it seemed impossible to contain. "Happy?" Richard asked softly, watching her face in the gentle lamplight. "Beyond anything I ever imagined possible," she replied with simple truth. Hand in hand they slipped from the nursery and made their way back toward the glittering ballroom below, where society awaited the return of the Duke and Duchess, whose unlikely love story had become the toast of London. No longer a scandal, but an inspiration. For in finding each other, Isadora and Richard had discovered not just personal happiness, but a truth too powerful to be denied, that love, true and genuine, recognized no boundaries of age or convention, and that it was never, ever too late to begin again. Dear listener, life, like the story of Isadora and Richard, rarely follows the path we expect. In a world that often celebrates youth above all else, it's easy to believe that our chances for love, for new beginnings, for joy diminish with each passing year. But Isadora's journey reminds us of a profound truth. It is never too late to find happiness. At 40, society had written Isadora's story for her, a tale of spinsterhood and quiet resignation. Yet her most beautiful chapter was just beginning. This wasn't despite her age, but because of it. The wisdom she had gathered, the self-knowledge she had cultivated, the dignity she had maintained through years of subtle dismissal, these were precisely the qualities that made her truly remarkable to someone who could see beyond society's narrow definitions of worth. Perhaps you too have felt invisible at times. Perhaps you've heard whispers that your moment has passed, that opportunities for love, adventure, or fulfillment belong to the young. But remember this: the most authentic connections often come when we have lived enough to know ourselves truly, when we have weathered disappointments and emerged with our kindness intact. Your life experience isn't a liability, it's your greatest strength. The patience you've developed, the perspective you've gained, the resilience you've built, these are treasures beyond price. Like Richard, the right people will recognize and cherish these qualities in you. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, know that your story continues to unfold in beautiful and unexpected ways. Rest well, knowing that the most meaningful chapters of your story may still lie ahead. You are seen, you are valued, and you are worthy of every happiness at every age. With deepest appreciation for sharing this journey with us, Legends of the Fall team. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. We hope Isadora and Richard's story reminded you that love has no age, and that being seen for who you truly are is the most romantic thing of all. If this story touched your soul, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with your loved ones. Your support motivates us to keep telling more stories full of love, redemption, and emotional twists. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions. With love, the Legends of the Fall team.